Good afternoon, everyone who is here, and I also want to welcome everyone who is tuning in online. And if you are online, if you'd like to be added to the Tzedek Council, to the newsletter, please just add your name in the chat. I'll remind you as we continue throughout here. And so I want to start off talking a little bit of Torah since we're here today, because it's interesting. I studied with this Orthodox rabbi years ago. And one of the things he pointed out, he knew a bunch of Reform rabbis in the room, so he goes, I'm going to say the G word, and you're all going to get really uncomfortable. He goes, but Yom Kippur, it's really about God. It's okay to get up there and just talk about God. It's a central feature. And so if I have him sitting on my shoulder or my head thinking about if that's the main thing you're supposed to be talking about, what am I doing talking about social justice and homelessness, and how does that whole thing connect together? And if you look at how the whole story actually begins in the Torah here in Genesis chapter 18, kind of the very beginning of the beginning, because we think of Abraham going through this journey and then having kids and struggling and arguing with God, but actually none of that happens yet. It actually takes a little bit. And right here in Genesis 18, it says at the very beginning that the Lord appears before him as Abraham is sitting at the tent of meeting. And then the most incredible part, Abraham's like, go away, God. There's 3 people over there I don't know, and I need to go take care of them. And completely ignores God and takes these 3 people, which he doesn't know at the time, they turn out to be angels, and he goes and he feeds them. And he gets them food, and he welcomes them. And once they see what he's really made up of, that he's not a person just sitting by the tent of meeting, meditating, because that's not our primary focus. The primary focus is, how do you look out past the world, and what is your role in it? Now, these three people that Abraham goes and cares for, they then turn and they say, it's going to work out well for you. You're going to have kids with your wife. And at this point, they've got to be kidding. You know, old, she's 90 years old. We're not going to have kids. But that's the beginning of the beginning. Once he was actually able to step out of his own world and realize he needed to take care of something beyond him, is when he's told that he's going to have this fruitful future. It's also right after that with Sodom and Gomorrah, when then he starts the conversation with God, and God says, listen, I'm going to wipe this city out. And Abraham goes, Chalila lecha, who do you think you are? You call yourself just and ethical? I'm going to tell you what justice and ethics looks like in the world, because God, your justice and ethics are not as righteous as mine. And God says, you're right. And that's the beginning of how this entire tradition starts, how we start theology, how we start pushing, and we start realizing that really what our central job in the world is not just looking within, but then asking ourselves, when we find that voice, how do we then push that energy out into the world to try to see the people that need our help? And with everything we have been through, not just in the past 18 months, because we've been talking about homelessness and refugees for years and years now, they just need more of our help than they needed before. And I know a lot of people are tired. That's okay. But that doesn't mean we stop. So I would like to pause for a moment, and we're going to take a minute just to watch this video together of some of the work that Emanu-El has been doing in this past year with the homeless prenatal program.
We could not do our work if it wasn't for the volunteers that we have, and like Congregation Emanu-El.
Oh yes, one of our honorees tonight. Tell us about that partnership.
Absolutely. Well, Congregation Emanu-El does so much for not only homeless prenatal program, but for San Francisco.
Yeah.
And last year at Yom Kippur, they chose the homeless prenatal program as one of their, to be part of their Tzedek project. And their Tzedek project is really social justice work. And I love the word tzedakah because, as I understand it, tzedakah means to give because it's the right thing to do. It means to give to make the world a better place for all. And it means to give without any expectations of recognition for giving. So it's like giving anonymously. But tonight, there will be no anonymity because what they do is so great. And one of the things I love best about what they do is every Wednesday, they bring a warm meal at noon to Jelani House, and the women say it is the best meal of the week. They really look forward to it, and let's have a look and see. We have a little video to celebrate Congregation Emanu-El.
Okay.
Thank you. We're excited to be here to bring food today.
Thank you.
For the women. Thank you.
Hi.
Thank
you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Lots of the people that are homeless right now or experiencing homelessness are people that can be helped and that have a future and that have a path forward. And being able to be part of that and to have my child help me do it, help me cook some of the meals, help me pack pajamas, is important and gives me hope that the next generation will also care for everyone equally.
It has been really wonderful partnering with HPP throughout this last year. From working on the doula bags, which is something that was very rewarding and included entire families. We did that over the holidays, and we were able to not only put together a lot of bags that help HPP clients, but we were able to include entire families.
So that's just a little bit of the video there of just getting a sense of the incredible work that our Tzedek Council has done this year with Melissa and Guillemette and Lisa and Joel, and really just, as the world changed and it got more challenging, really trying to figure out how do we change in order to continue to serve. And so the amount of work that our leaders did that HPP wanted to come and honor Emanu-El. So I want to thank you all for what you've done. With this afternoon, we are lucky enough to have Dr. Sheryl Davis be our keynote speaker today to kind of give us a state of the union of where we are in San Francisco. Sheryl Evans Davis, she joined the Human Rights Commission in 2011, serving as a commissioner, and was appointed as director of the department in 2016. For more than 20 years during her career as an educator, nonprofit administrator, legislative staffer, and city commissioner, Davis has championed the historically marginalized and the underserved. She's the founding director of MoMagic, a social justice collaborative program of the Public Defender's Office. Since 2019, Davis has worked to build out an equity framework with the San Francisco community stakeholders and the city departments, working always to keep collaboration at the very center. So if we could please give her a warm welcome, Dr. Sheryl Davis.
Good afternoon. How's everyone doing? So I am really honored, and I want to thank Rebecca and the council for the invitation. It's interesting, I actually, listening to Rabbi talk, I actually grew up in Black Baptist church. My stepfather was a pastor, and so as he was speaking and talking about Genesis, and I just thought about in the context of what we're talking about today, the model and the idea of the creation, this idea of making something out of nothing and building something and being responsive and being innovative is really where we are in this conversation about addressing homelessness. It really is a challenge, not just in San Francisco and not even just statewide now. We know that nationally it is a pandemic in and of itself. And we take so very much for granted. I try to start each morning with a moment of reflection and gratitude, calming myself and trying to prepare for the day. And this morning when I woke up, I was grateful for a shower, some oatmeal, and the fact that my son didn't eat all the blackberries and there were still some in the refrigerator. And when I thought about it this morning, I said, I wanted that last night because this has been such a really difficult week. And I thought if I have a little bit of oatmeal and a warm shower, they say that that will help you sleep better. And when I was thinking about preparing for today, I said, that is such a small thing in so many ways to kind of lose sight of and just kind of move forward and not realize how special that is. And I thought about the folks who have not been able to have a shower or make a decision about oatmeal, or even the ability to just sit in silence, to control their environment, to be able to be in space, to have space alone, and that there's so much more to this conversation and the idea of well-being that we kind of lose sight of as we move forward. And so when we go through this process and we wonder and we wrestle with how we fit into this context, again, I'm thinking about someone like Moses, who when he was called to do the work said, I'm not equipped to do it. I can't speak, I can't do, like, why choose me? And I think we all have a role to play, and we cannot get locked into, I appreciate you, Rabbi, saying think higher of yourself, right? We can't get locked into downplaying our role and our relevance into something that seems so huge and so really hard to attain. And in a lot of ways, the question is, how do we keep faith, even in those moments when it seems hopeless? So based on 2017 data, and we talk about this idea of addressing or tackling a very difficult problem, 2017 data had over 28,000 people in the state of California who were homeless. Well, actually in the Bay Area counties. And 70% of those 28,000 were in 3 counties: San Francisco, Santa Clara, and Alameda County. And so this is based on a federal point in time census count. And the challenge here is that it's an undercount. That if we think that there are 28,000 and 70% of those 28,000 are in 3 counties, and we know that it's undercounted, that we really have no idea the real vast majority of folks who are homeless. And that as we go through this process, understanding even a little bit more that there are a lot of folks who are homeless who maybe don't even consider themselves homeless because they are what we call couch surfing. And so there's a large population of folks who are sleeping on someone else's couch because they have family, because they have networks, and they're able to find a different place to sleep each night. We don't consider them homeless, and they don't consider themselves homeless, but if somebody doesn't open the door for them that night, where do they go? And so when we start to talk about and when we start to paint the picture of what homelessness is or who is homeless, I think we really have to challenge this norm of how we define and who we think that we are trying to house. I think it becomes really easy, especially here in San Francisco, to really try and relegate homelessness to one area of the city and define it as people who are mentally ill or on drugs. And then it becomes a way for us to easily overlook and ignore and justify turning our head the other way. So 2019 point in time, 8,000 people, over 8,000 in San Francisco were homeless. And again, I come back to, I taught kindergarten for a long time, and I always have these poems and things that I think about in my mind, and I often go back to a poem by Maya Angelou, which says, "Life doesn't frighten me at all." And there's a line in there that she says, "Don't show me frogs and snakes and listen for my screams. If I'm afraid at all, it's only in my dreams." So sometimes it's easier to deal with the reality than it is to dream and hope that things will be better, right? So we become resigned to the fact that we have a homelessness problem and that there are 8,000 people, and we go, well, that's just the way it is. And that when we look at these numbers, we're seeing things increase. So again, it becomes easier to just say that is the way of life and to not try and tackle the problem. And so I would say the first thing that I would ask folks to do is to not lose hope, to not get into this place where life and what we've come to expect is the norm, and we're afraid to dream or try or push to do something better. We have to continue to keep trying, to innovate, to create, and know that in that creation that there may be some things that aren't perfect, or that it may not go the way that we want it to, but that we have to continue to believe and hope. There's a collection of sermons by Dr. King called The Strength to Love. And in that collection, there's a line that he talks about being able to confront our shattered dreams. And I think it is so easy to get caught up in the frustration around homelessness. And so we hear and we talk a lot about what's not working, or the state of the streets, or what's happening, or there's no commitment. And so, yes, we want to confront those dreams, that they're shattered and that we're not addressing it in the way that we want. But we cannot stay focused on the shattered. We have to focus on the hope and the belief, and to continue to try and advance the work. And I say that because, I'm looking at the data, and it's saying 2019, there was a 17% increase. And sometimes people focus on the increase. And there are things that are happening. There are things that we can try to do. So of that 8,000 that we know of in San Francisco, 70% of them, again, this narrative that everybody's coming from somewhere else because San Francisco does too much to help homeless people, and so most of the homeless people that come here don't live here, becomes the narrative again to, in a lot of ways, villainize people. 70% were living in San Francisco before they're homeless, before being unhoused. 22% came from another county, and 8% from another state, right? So when we start to drill down on those numbers, the narrative around who is homeless, and in some way, really we need to be mindful of and shy away from trying to talk about who's worthy of help and support. Because when we start to categorize and talk about, well, who's from here and who's not, it's almost like we're saying, well, if you weren't homeless before, if you didn't live in San Francisco before your homelessness situation, we don't think we should help you. And I think that as we move through these conversations, there is a lot of debate about what should be happening. So for some of that, there are a lot of really great programs where folks are connecting people with their family members and their loved ones outside of San Francisco, where they are helping them get connected, where a lot of times their family members didn't even know where they were. So on one hand, people are connected with their families, but then someone will say, well, not everyone wants to be reconnected with their family. Part of why they came here was to get away from a traumatic situation. I share that because this battle and this discussion and this frustration around homelessness is not quite as easy and simple and clear and clean as people would like it to be. So some folks would say, put everyone who's not from here, who wasn't living here before they were homeless, on a bus and send them somewhere else. And others would say, well, let's really understand who they are and why they're here, and still provide support in a compassionate way. Those are the challenges. Those are the realities that we face. Because the story is we should put everyone on a bus and send them back somewhere for some people. But what if the somewhere is back here? What if the bus that we need to put them on is a bus from downtown to the marina? We have to have conversations about what does it look like to have what people have called for a compassionate approach. 31% of the population, homeless population, has been identified or self-identifies as chronically homeless, which means that they have been continuously homeless for 12 months, or that they have, over the course of 3 years, when you put all the time together of their incidence of homelessness, it measures up to accounts for 12 months. That's a long time to be without a home. And what I've heard when I've done outreach, and I personally try to make sure that whenever I'm having a conversation about something, that it's not centered in just what I read on paper or what I think, but that it's centered in the lived experiences of the folks who are most impacted. And what we've heard from people is that they don't want to have to wait 12 months to be considered homeless to get the help that they need. That's one piece of it. And they also don't want to wait until they are in dire straits, right? Where they are having a mental episode, or where they are in medical need because they weren't able to get the help. This is what we've heard from even the predictors of homelessness that have to do with poverty, that has to do with being in safe spaces, that has to do with being comfortable in your skin and who you are. is that a lot of times you have to go into crisis before you can get help. And so a lot of this conversation that we're working on and building on is how are we more intentional? What does that look like? The other piece that is extremely sad, 9% are families. So the narrative around who it is that needs help, who it is that we're centering, 9% families. That's someone with children that doesn't have a place to sleep or that is sleeping in a shelter and that is their housing situation. How are we making sure that we're not just using broad strokes to tell the story of who is homeless in San Francisco? 17% transitional aged youth, youth under the age of 25. Some who have come to San Francisco fleeing very traumatic and difficult situations. Some who are coming here because they believe that there is hope and resources and support, only to come here and not be able to take advantage of what my grandfather used to call milk and honey, this idea of getting to the land of milk and honey, and that some folks were coming here for that and weren't able to achieve it. 10% are veterans. So again, this broad stroke of who's homeless and who's worthy of help, it's not quite the picture that is often painted. So I say the constant question or the seemingly unanswerable and definitely unanswered question is, what do we do? What do we do? How do we address this? And therein again lies these different challenges and problems, because a lot of times it gets politicized and we lose sight of the people, we lose sight of humanity. So I'm going to share with you some comments that I got from some community members. One, a tenant advocate. Good people are doing what they can. It's not working. He's questioning. He said, is the system doing what it's supposed to do? Because maybe it's designed not to work. Choices for housing. I'm not surprised that people turn down housing. That sometimes the housing that is offered is actually worse than being on the streets. It's less safe than being on the streets. Because again, when we decide or define who is worthy of support, we don't maybe make the investments or give the same type of support that we would if we valued the lives of those folks. And then he said, efforts are important and worthy of praise, but lacking needed investment and accountability. And so what does that mean to define accountability, to define investment? Another service provider shared the same language around the system isn't working. He said something that I would again really challenge us to have these conversations and thoughts about, like, how are we making the difference? What does the work look like? He said, we need an increase in case managers, so people who are supporting folks. But even beyond the increase in case managers, they need to make a living wage. So what does the investment look like? If we invest in resources and spaces, but we haven't invested in the support, and if we don't value the people who are providing the support to be able to take care of themselves, because when we talk about vicarious trauma, when we talk about helping people who have been through traumatic situations, not only do we need to be providing the ability for people to take care of themselves financially and to be able to live and to buy food, but they need to be able to practice self-care, right? They need to be able to afford a vacation. They need to be able to afford to go to therapy or to go and get a massage, all the things that we may take for granted that need to be built into our everyday life. I talked with a person who was formerly homeless, and I'm not even sure of his current situation, and he said, data collection, right? The quantitative and the qualitative, because we're telling these stories, but the stories are not necessarily rooted and founded in honest data, and it's not founded in the narrative or the story of the folks that are experiencing it. So staying hopeful. There are lots of debates as I begin to kind of summarize and share where we are now. There are lots of debates about what is the right thing to do. But it all revolves around resources, collaboration and resources. What does it look like for us to allocate resources? What does it look like to do better coordination of services? And the last one I would say is, what does it look like in terms of support? So this idea of providing resources and support also is largely about supply, and it's also about coordination. So what we keep hearing over and over again is that part of this is about there aren't enough places for folks to live. The other piece is that there aren't enough places for people to be able to afford to live. 2/3 of the low-income households are struggling to pay rent. So they are that much closer to being homeless. So when we talk about families, when we talk about veterans, when we talk about folks who have medical issues and challenges, understanding that if now I've got to come out of pocket for cost to go to the doctor, and that ends up being a little bit more than I expected, that may jeopardize my ability to actually pay my rent. There's more nuances to this piece of the work. So scarcity of resources has become this debate where we talk about whether we're enabling people or whether it's a scarcity of resources. Are we doing too much for people and now they're just coming to San Francisco in order to take advantage of resources? Or are they not the right resources? Do we need to think about where we're investing and how we're investing? There's a lot of burnout in terms of the people who have built the trusted relationships with community members, that have the lived experience. How are we making sure that those investments and those resources are properly used? Prevention and response. This is the question that keeps coming up and over again. What does it look like? How are we doing more around prevention? How are we addressing the predictors, if we know what the predictors of homelessness are? How are we addressing the challenges and the needs of mental health? How are we really thinking about what affordable housing looks like? I was talking to someone the other day, and they were reminding me that here in San Francisco, $75,000 a year for one person is low income. So when I go to visit family in the South where, they're making $50,000 a year and they think that they're living a pretty good life, and then you think about San Francisco, $75,000 a year will probably make it very difficult for you to pay after taxes your rent, buy food, get to and from work, but now that folks are working virtually, but even for folks that don't have that luxury and that choice to be able to work virtually, what are the added costs to actually live? Those are very stressful things. Just think about how the pandemic has impacted people who have the ability to work remotely, who have the ability to go to the store and stock up and buy up all the goods that they can. How much more stressful is it for someone who is living paycheck to paycheck, who is worried about their place of business shutting down? So there's a report from McKinsey that said 39% of homelessness in San Francisco is impacted by mental health issues, 28% substance abuse. We go on and look and think about those folks who are incarcerated. 30% of the people who are incarcerated are homeless. And so it asks these questions about why are people, I've heard young people say that I've talked to young people who said that they committed an act to get arrested so that they could have a place to sleep. That they committed something, they did something, whether it was graffiti or got into a fight so that they could have a place to sleep, have a meal, but also get some medical attention. What are we doing? How are we functioning in a place where we are making it where folks can't have access to those things? What is our investment? What's our commitment? So ultimately, at this point in time, as we all probably know far too well, there are no easy answers. And there's not really a picture of what homelessness is in San Francisco. There are some really great practices and successes that have happened. The city recently launched the San Francisco Crisis Response Team. They have, over the last few months, interacted with over 1,500 people. They have been able to go out and support and engage and address immediate needs, but the challenge still remains. And this is what we heard from through the process when Mayor Breed was hosting her alternative to policing sessions and engagements with community members. And we talked with people with lived experience who said there are a couple of things to understand. A plan without resources is not a plan. If we put it on paper, but we do not have the resources to put people into beds, if there are no beds to put people into, if there's no long-term housing for them to go into, then the cycle will continue. If there are no supportive housing resources, if we are merely just giving people a place to live without a plan for how they're going to pay for their rent, how they're going to provide for food, and if we're going to meet the other challenges that they are facing. If you get a chance, there was a program in Santa Clara, and I can make sure to share the information so it can be shared out. They did a study of permanent supportive housing and the successes that came from that. And the interesting piece is that they chose people with acute medical issues, folks who had been hospitalized and had more than 5 incidents where they were going to the emergency room within a certain short span. And what they found is that 86% of those folks, just around there, I think it was 86 of those folks, were able to participate and engage in the program, that they wanted housing when they made it available. 93% of them, of the 86% that participated, 93% of them actually completed and are still housed. But the other thing that they didn't expect that happened was that the folks who were housed, even though they previously had had multiple trips to the emergency room, had other medical issues, that those outcomes actually improved as well. That wasn't something they expected because the medical issues and the mental health issues had been so acute that they just assumed that they were going to be able to support them and provide that housing, but they actually saw the added benefit of being stabilized, being in stable housing, impacted their mental health, their medical, physical health as well. So as we move forward, as we have these conversations, a compassionate, community-centered, community-informed approach can make the difference. But what we really have to focus on, what we really have to work on is not losing hope, right? To not get bogged down by what we see or to get bogged down in the stereotypes of who we think are the homeless people and why are they homeless, because it's much more complicated than that. And so what I say, and my charge is to everyone, is to, as I again go back to Maya Angelou, this idea of, she has a line in one of her poems that says, "You may trod me in the very dirt, but still like dust I rise." So things may be difficult. We may be down, we may be downtrodden, but we don't lose hope. That in those moments we take the time to look around and that we take the time to stay hopeful and we really get ready to rise. And that in our rising, just like dust, anyone who's ever been in a kick up of dust, it doesn't rise one particle, you know? It's all those pieces together, and that as we rise, as we kick up the dust, that we rise and we bring others with us, because we are all from dirt. We are all going back to that space, and we are all no better than the next, regardless of what our lot in life is at this point in time. So as we do this work, as we think about this work, that we see ourselves and that we fight for social justice in the name of, as it's better for me, it's better for you. And as I help you, you help me. And so I just challenge you all to stay hopeful, to keep believing, and to keep doing the work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I do have questions.
Yeah.
And you know, the Tzedek Council, we spent a lot of time thinking of, since we were lucky enough to have you, of what we wanted to ask. And you know, one of the things that comes up is that, and I know this will shock you, that our friends and our families, they criticize us. They say, what is all this work you're doing with the homelessness? And it feels like San Francisco's getting nowhere. What is your, well, what is your suggestion for us in the response to that?
I mean, I think that's the hard one, right? Because depending on where folks are, it's very real to them, right? Like you don't see it getting better. You don't necessarily, you're stepping over feces and you're not sure if it's human or if it's dog. And I think what I keep coming back to is this idea of, for one, the sake of one, right? And so if you are making an impact in the life of one person, it has to be enough in some way. It starts with one, doing that first step, that first piece. And it's so easy to become jaded and frustrated and look at what's happening and say it's not working, but the numbers say otherwise. I would say, you know, we did a lot of work during the pandemic around homelessness and trying to work really collectively and collaboratively with folks in the Tenderloin specifically. And what we heard from people in the Tenderloin is that that collaborative approach of bringing everyone together and really addressing the problem, that they saw the impact, but that it took so much work, and that to folks maybe on the outside, maybe they don't see it, but that in the community, they saw that impact, they see that work. I think the hard part for me is that it doesn't look the way people want it to look. So when we think about some of the Tenderloin work, the fact that there are now, you know, between the library and the Asian Art Museum, there's a space for a tent encampment. And some people may not like that. That may not be progress to them. But for the people that were living and the tents were aligned on the sidewalk, it is an impact. It is a difference. And so I think the one thing would be, it doesn't look the way you want it to look, doesn't mean it's not working. The other is, I always put it back on folks. I went a couple of weeks ago to a dinner, and I was an event, and I was staffing the mayor, and I ended up at a table with some folks that I didn't know. And they were all, you know, talking about homelessness and the challenge and the issues, and, you know, and then they leaned over to me, and they didn't know me, and they were like, "What do you think about what the mayor's doing?" And I said, "Well, I work for her." And then I said to them, I said, "But I guess my question is, what are your suggestions?" I don't know. What do you think we should do? You know, what is the humane and the loving, compassionate way to respond? And when I put it back to them, they said, "Well, I don't know either." And I think we're all in this moment of I don't know, and it's really easy to pass judgment on the folks who are trying. But I would say, if you have an idea, bring it to the table, and let's try and move it forward.
I mean, I love the idea of the one. Yeah, it's even in the Talmud. You talk in the Talmud that you save one life. It's like you've saved the entire world. And they're big fluffy language. They're not being fluffy, because if you think about the generational effects of what you're having, conversely, if you do nothing for that individual, you're also destroying generations. But just when you're talking about, you know, where the perception issue, that there's progress is being made, but you can't see it, and perception does matter. There's an interesting, I don't think it's a law. It's not a law in Judaism, but it's a fairly strong cultural part that I'm not supposed to go into a non-kosher restaurant with a yarmulke on. Because the perception is that I'm telling everybody, look, the place is kosher. So if I go in, I take the yarmulke off. Because how I'm communicating and how the world sees it matters. So what do you think we can do about the perception issue of where we are, if we're making progress, of where we are today and really where we're going?
I think that's the hard part, because in celebrating progress, you almost have to elevate the people who have been helped, which in some way is, it's abusive of them, right? So we have to say, look what I did for this person, or look how we're helping these folks. And so in the truest sense, we do this work because it's the right thing to do, not for the attention. I was talking to somebody yesterday, and we were just having this conversation about how do you stay optimistic when pessimism is like the way of the world, right? Like
it's the brand of 2021.
And really finding, why are we doing it, ultimately? I think that's the question. Why are we doing this work? And Is it to prove that we're doing the work and that it's having an impact? Or is it the satisfaction of having an impact? Or is it just because it's what we're supposed to do? And I don't have the answer for that. I used to get in trouble all the time because I'd go into spaces and I'd talk and I'd say, well, we're working on this and we're doing that. And they'd say, well, who's we? And I'd say, well, I don't necessarily want to say I'm doing it because I'm not doing it, right? We're all collectively doing it. And there's something about owning that we are collectively making a difference and being okay with knowing that each individual is doing their part. Because I do believe if each individual does their part, we will see it. And so stop putting it on what is the government doing, what is the organization that's being funded doing, because part of this is the humanity we see in people and being able to see someone, have them feel valued, have them feel cared for, actually has the power to do more than me giving them a few dollars. The sense of value, the sense of care, and the sense of like wherever you choose to live or wherever you live, whether it's with choice or not, that you're still human and you're still valuable. I don't know, I just think that it's a hard one that I really struggle with in terms of how do we prove that we're making a difference? And I don't know that we can ever really prove because there's always going to be something that's not right that people will say and find fault with.
Well, let me ask you, how do you think reforms in the criminal justice system can actually help decrease homelessness?
Well, what we've found with the crisis response that's been happening already is that having this more compassionate approach allows folks to actually have their needs met. So when somebody is in a mental health crisis and and they're not violent and they don't have a weapon, and someone comes and is able to talk to them, it's different. When we were having these conversations about alternatives to policing and when do you dispatch police officers and when do you work with community, we heard from a lot of folks that their trauma impacts when the police show up and that all of a sudden things escalate higher than they would if it was just someone from community that came and said, what's wrong, what's happening? The other piece around this is that there are folks who aren't violent, who weren't maybe as bad as they end up being before incarceration. Trauma and mental health issues that go undiagnosed end up in things that happen on the streets and with people doing things that they sometimes aren't fully in control of themselves. And so this conversation about justice reform, it's interesting. I came off of a bad week where somebody misinterpreted something that was said. This isn't about people getting away with doing bad things, right? This isn't giving people a pass to do things that cause harm to other folks. This is about prevention. This is about the ability to see a need and help someone before they're in crisis and before they do something.
Do you see it as a prevention on long-term incarceration?
I think it's a prevention, yes, on incarceration. If we are honest about our failures and our systemic failures and what's happening, when we look at, for instance, in San Francisco, where less than 6% of the population is Black, but more than 40% of the folks incarcerated are Black. Then you couple that with mental health and homelessness. A lot of the things that we see happening could have been avoided before folks were incarcerated. But it goes back to, I literally, last year we were having conversations because the city's been exploring closing juvenile hall. And I went to a continuation school, and it's so funny because people have these ideas about who folks are, and went to a continuation school to talk to some young people who had been systems and justice involved, and so conservative in their thinking, very quick to be about punishment and punitive, and they couldn't believe that there were any conversations about closing juvenile hall, even though they themselves had been in the system and had been impacted, and they thought people need to pay for the harm they've caused, there are consequences. But many of them talked about the things that they had done. It wasn't that they woke up in the morning and thought they were going to do something bad, but they were in a situation or a space where they felt they had to protect themselves, or they needed food, or they were hanging out with people because they didn't feel safe at home and they got caught up in something they didn't want to be a part of. And they talked about if they had had a mentor, if they had had somebody who actually saw that they were hurting, or the people that they had reached out to had been responsive, they never would have gone in the direction that they had gone in. So there is a lot to be said about making those investments on the front end and valuing everyone. And more than that, helping them to value themselves.
I mean, so I guess related to that, as well as, there's a complicated relation between homelessness and drug use as well. How do you see those two interacting, and how, I guess, would be more helpful in that?
It's again, I mentioned earlier, I'm like originally born in Texas, and my grandmother was like, at church 3-4 times a week, and my stepfather was a pastor, and these ideas that now are surfacing, my family, old school family would blink several times and widen their eyes. There's all this conversation, it's, about sober houses or wet houses, and do we have safe injection sites, and what does this look like? And this is why I think the folks I talked to that with lived experience around homelessness said data is important, right? So if the data shows that actually safe injection sites prevent people from overdosing and prevent people from being on the streets using drugs, and connects them with resources that actually we see fewer people using once they participate in that, it doesn't make sense to be against it, right, in some ways. And I think that's the question that folks have, like, are we actually following the data, or have we really tracked the data? Because what we keep coming back to is, what's the real story, right? Like, nobody, I don't know how, I'm going to date myself, and I don't know if folks remember, there used to be this commercial, I don't know if it was a commercial, but like a PSA that when I came home from school that came on, and there was a girl that was dancing, and then they'd say, nobody wakes up and says, I want to be a drug addict, right? Like, that's not the dream for when you grow up. Like, nobody wakes up and says, today I want to overdose.
To date myself, I know that ad. Okay.
And so there was the thing, there was also one that was like, this is your brain
on drugs.
This is your brain on drugs. Like, so the skillet
in between the cartoons, yeah.
Yes. And I keep going back to that, because this idea that we think that someone who uses drugs is not in some way struggling with something. Like, nobody wakes up and says, like, I want to be addicted to drugs. I want to be sleeping on the streets shooting up. Like, that is not a healthy way of thinking. And so when we start to talk about this, like, we're never really trying to get to the root causes, right? Like, somebody was telling me the other day, helping me understand upstream, downstream, and they're like, you're downstream, you're pulling babies out the water, but somebody needs to go upstream and figure out who's putting all the babies in the water. And so I think I keep going back to that, and I like the babies piece of it, because we haven't done enough to save our babies, and now we're on the end of it, and maybe they're not babies downstream, but they're still babies. Like, they're still somebody's baby, somebody's child, and it's not enough to just say someone is a drug addict or a dope fiend or they're this, and so now we're done with them. Like, there is something that happened that created a space for that. And so, yes, we need to address that, but what are the best, I think there's a lot of debate over what's the best way to address it. And I don't have the answers, but I would say, again, let's go back to the data. Because if the data says that this actually decreases the number of folks who are using, isn't that what we want? Don't we want to see fewer people on the streets? And even if nothing else, it makes it safer for the people who are trying to pass, that have to step over folks. Isn't that, again, the beginning of change? It just always comes back to relationships. Are we creating spaces to connect with people, to understand what their full need is, and to address it?
I love the idea of data. It feels like that's a bit of a controversy in our country at this point, that some is data-driven. This area, thank God, is quite data-driven. You said earlier that, I wrote it down, I loved it, you said, basically there's no plan if you don't have resources. And now, after all these years of waiting, the Prop C money is here. And so I guess my final question for you is, when you're kind of looking out at this landscape of, the upstream, the downstream of all of it together, where do you think the best place to put that money is to try to help our city out?
I've really struggled with this one because everyone has their best idea. And I'm glad, this is why I am glad, that I'm not the mayor, and this is why I know I will never run for political office, because somebody has to make those hard decisions. And so the question becomes, do you focus on the data, right? And fortunately, to your point, for the most part, we agree with facts and data, and that's easy enough for folks to get behind. I have really been looking at some of the data across other indicator groups and other cultural groups and other kind of focus groups. And, at a point people are like, well, it's too far gone on this side. Should we just let that go and focus on the next generation? But the quality of life for everyone is impacted on not focusing on point in time right here. And I think I feel like, and it's a bad analogy, right? It's the story of splitting the baby. Ultimately, that was used to show who cared the most, right? Who was the person who said, no, fine. I don't want the baby split in half. And so I don't know what that looks like here, because I do think that there's a need to really hit it across all the spaces and then really see long-term where we get the most impact, to do the impact analysis. So what I suggest and what I think needs to happen more of is actually the data collection, right? We invest in the solutions, but we don't measure the solutions, right? And so it's very much kind of anecdotal, or it's based on who funded the specific thing. And of course, they're going to tell the story to justify their funding. So how do we get to the place where we're actually paying neutral third-party folks to do an assessment and come back and tell us, actually, return on investment-wise, this is where you get more bang for your buck? And I think we just have not, we haven't done that. Everybody does some level of analysis, but I would say that it's jaded and biased from whoever is funding, because nobody wants to say they wasted their money.
Yeah. Well, I cannot thank you enough for coming in, sharing your wisdom, and spending the holiest day of the entire year with us. We're deeply appreciative. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I want us to just take a minute now to just pause and look back in a video we have put together of really what the Tzedek Council has accomplished since last Yom Kippur.
Amen.
It's incredible. I mean, amazing. I mean, if you think about where we were, 20 years ago before the pandemic, at least that's what it feels like, that the world radically changed and we had to really shift on how we took care of our community. And Lisa, Joel, and Melissa, the whole Tzedek Council has just been unbelievable in that pivot. And just looking at what's been accomplished here, it's staggering. So thank you. And thank you all of you for making this happen. The numbers are amazing. So now it is my honor to invite up Sally, who's the executive director of the Youth Spirit Artworks. And Sally is, even with the mask on, she's like this bright, shining light. And we started this relationship with them earlier this year. I guess it was in the spring, and we kind of launched into the summer of this Tiny Houses program that is absolutely gorgeous. And so I'm going to invite Sally up to tell you more about it, and with this new partnership which we're developing.
Hello, it's so wonderful to be here with you. I'm Sally Heineman, as Rabbi was saying, Executive Director at Youth Spirit Artworks, and this is Eli Strife, one of the leaders from our program, and we want to share with you some more about the amazing, amazing work that Temple Emanu-El has done in supporting our organization. And we're going to tell you a little bit about Youth Spirit Artworks and specifically talk to you about our Tiny House Village and the work that we're doing in partnership together. So first of all, I want to say that this is really going to be a story about faith in action and hope in action, and really about surrendering to God and what it's like when any of us just decides that God's love is unstoppable, that there's this covenant, and that covenant calls us to believe that there are solutions, and that we, as the imperfect people that we are, can come up with those solutions and achieve things that are monumental and can be models. So first, I just want to say a little bit about Youth Spirit Artworks for those of you who don't know. We are a strongly youth-led, interfaith nonprofit organization that is 14 years old, and we are based in South Berkeley, in Berkeley, and we operate all over the Bay Area, primarily right now still in the East Bay. We're working with over 150 young people each year, ages 16 to 25, and our focus is on using art as a vehicle for empowering and transforming the lives of young people. We're a jobs readiness and jobs training program, and we're moving towards placing youth in jobs when they pursue pathways. We train youth along 8 different vocational pathways in our program towards living wage jobs, placing youth in living wage jobs. So we just really appreciated the keynote and the words that were shared, because they really fit with our organization's whole approach, which is we've got our sleeves rolled up and we're just going to do the work and come up with solutions and see what God can do, you know. And I can say I'm a member of Temple, an active member at Temple Bethel in Berkeley, and our child was bat mitzvah there. So we are just thrilled to be partnering with the Jewish community, and we're going to be saying more about that. But anyway, so Youth Spirit Artworks was running as part of the work that we do, running a day program serving homeless youth from the shelter back in 2016. And one of our pathways that we train youth on is community organizing. And when I say that, think Stacey Abrams. You know, we really believe that youth empowerment it needs to be central, that youth learning about their power to change the world needs to be central in everything that we do. And so we were asking youth from the shelter that were involved in our program about what the key concerns that they had were that they would want to do community organizing around to create change. And we were having meetings on Wednesday nights and in our space, and so we started to talk with youth, and they were telling us that they were staying in the shelter and they weren't getting placed into housing, and it was just really, really hard for them, that their energy was just completely stuck, and they weren't able to set goals and really move forward because they just felt like sleeping on the floor of a church that they had been doing was just wiping them out. It took everything that they had just to kind of make it through every day. And it was just super depressing to them and creating a lot of sort of more trauma that they weren't getting placed into any permanent housing because there was such a permanent housing shortage. And so we started saying to them, well, what would you guys think of that you would want to do in response to this? And they said, well, we need to get off the floor of this darn shelter. We want housing that makes it so we can have our own individual homes. And we think that tiny houses actually could be something that could help us. And so we started to continue to have meetings about this, and the youth ended up working with a volunteer architect and contractor in designing a tiny house, and then they ended up coming up with a design for what a tiny house village that they might have would look like. And so we started to kind of work with the idea that vacant properties and properties that were in transition in the Bay Area, raise your hand if you've seen property where, it's just lying fallow. Maybe it's going to get developed later. Have you seen those? In Oakland, they have 4,000 vacant properties. And then there's other properties that businesses have that they're sitting on and they're waiting to develop later, right? Have you guys seen those? And so the idea that we came up with collectively was that we would make use of vacant space that was possibly in transition and maybe was going to be something else 5 years from now or 7 years from now, but that we would pursue creating a tiny house village that was a youth-led program. Our youth wanted to do this. And so we would go for doing that, creating their own tiny house village. And so we continued to have meetings and took youth to they went to a zillion different city council meetings. Our idea was that a lot of these youth were from Berkeley, so they thought, well, we want to be in Berkeley. And they tried for a really long time in Berkeley to create this village and ran into major serious neighbor problems in Berkeley. Raise your hand if you've heard that Berkeley's got some NIMBY, not in my backyard kind of struggles. I think people still have some ethical contradictions between the property value that they have and who's going to live near them. But anyway, and so we ended up, literally our youth went to over 200 meetings, and they ended up involving the religious community super deeply in what they did. And at the point where we thought we were just the most kind of forlorn about having trouble getting this approved in Berkeley, Temple Bethel came forward and made us their 2-year Tikkun Olam project. That they decided that they felt clear they wanted to be in solidarity with our young people and help our young people reach their dream. And once Bethel did that, which just tells you, all these other congregations ended up getting involved, and every Jewish congregation in the East Bay, and then other congregations from around the whole Bay Area all partnered with us, and we ended up with 45 interfaith partner congregations that everybody just rolled up their sleeves and said, we want to help these youth. We want to be in solidarity with these youth in being powerful and reaching their dream. And so the youth project that they came up with ultimately was to create 100 homes for homeless youth. They don't want just 25 or 10 or whatever. They decided they want 100 homes. And so the first tiny house village that they made is the first of multiple tiny house village that they're planning on creating, which is super exciting. But after attending, just a trillion meetings and being at a lot of congregation presentations and meetings with donors and all these different things, the city of Oakland ended up giving us 2 acres of land for free over by the Coliseum. And so we have a 3-year renewable lease that's zero cost. We had we came into it, and I mean, when I say faith in action, like we really had no idea where we were going to get the money or how we were going to pull this off. It was, it was all faith. But we ended up with a donor who gave us $200,000 for the project, who decided that instead of having a house in Carmel, he would create a tiny house village, basically, so to speak. And so we were able to leverage the money that we, were raised from individuals and raise other foundation money, and just it was an incredible miracle. And we ended up raising $1.3 million, and the tiny house village opened February 17th. With an amazing interfaith service. It was during Passover. The service was April 2nd, our grand opening, and we had Rabbi Mates Muchin from Temple Sinai, and then Rabbi Stern from Temple Bethel gave an incredible sermon, and then we had members of the interfaith religious community, imams and abbots and so on, and just incredible. The mayors of both Berkeley and Oakland were there. And so youth moved into the village. We have 24 residents and then 4 resident assistants. And so it's just been this amazing, amazing success. And that was all, during COVID. Over 3,000 volunteers were involved in the project, working. Nobody got COVID. But we were just so grateful for our partnership with Temple Emanu-El, because as you guys know and could see from the slides, you guys created this just beautiful outdoor community space, for the village and with the village. And so we're going to be able to use that space going forward for barbecues and meetings with our residents, outdoor meetings with our residents, and just all different kinds of activities. So we were just incredibly grateful and thankful for Temple Emanu-El's involvement in just actively going out, and even during COVID, and being part of doing the work that is creating change. And Eli's going to talk more about specific aspects of the village that he was involved with, because he was one of the main leaders that created this village, and just astounding leader. But I just want to say a tiny little bit more. There's a number of further projects that are getting done, and so with finishing this village, and then we're having preliminary meetings towards the next project that we're going to be involved with. And so we're sort of taking all the momentum that we created through this tiny house village, and we're bringing that all to the next project. So we're super excited about what's going to be next. But we're continuing to finishing touches on this village. Like, for example, our medical clinic, we're working with a whole team of pro bono medical professionals, and they're going to be, working with our youth on a weekly basis. And our medical clinic is just about to open in about a week. So there's a whole, aspects of the village that are just getting started up. But we're very excited about more work that's being done to make the community space just perfect, and then other work that we're going to be engaged with Temple Emanu-El in 2021-22. So I want to turn it over to Eli to talk about the work that he did with the Tiny House Village that was just made it everything that it is, really.
Hello. Can you hear me here? All right, cool. I don't have to go that close. My name is Eli Strife. I'm a youth leader at Youth Spirit Artworks, and I've been with YSA since about 2016, roughly, and majorly I had a role in the Tiny House Village in being the person that helped coordinate all of the murals, but I kind of want to bring it back to something the keynote speaker said, touched up on a little bit, that had me, that resonated with me, and that had me thinking about the importance of projects like this, that it's important to reimagine your perception of who is really homeless and who is really experiencing that pain. and not pain, but that experience, you know, and the importance of having a space where you can feel good in, and where you're comfortable, and where you're alone, and where you're safe, and where you have everything you need, because that plays into everything, every aspect of your life, and how you're interacting with the people around you, and what your values are, and what's important to you as a person. So like even like our own, and that's kind of what I wanted to bring in with the art too, of making this space somewhere that feels welcoming and that feels beautiful, that homeless, low-income housing and shelters or Section 8 is usually thought of as like, essentially in the public eye, as like a drug rehabilitation center or something like that, when it's low-income housing is really, it's like, we wanted to not just provide a home for someone or just a couch to sleep on, but a community and somewhere real that they can experience, and that their community in the street and where they grew up and the spirit of the city is with them there, being in its actuality. And that was in my role and in my what I helped with was the art of bringing like a majority of there's over 200 murals at the village, and a majority of them are done by folks that have experienced homelessness or that are low income and that are under 25 years old, which is my age too. And like not only the art, but of reimagining like who needs help and who can we actually provide all the needs for. Like, for example, someone who is currently housed at the village, before they were at the village, they were sleeping in their car and staying in the car. And they had a full-time job. They would go to work every day, 9 to 5, and then go shower at their friend's house. And if you saw them in the street, they would have clean clothes. They look like a normal young 21-year-old kid, you know, but they sleep in their car every night, you know? And so that's like an example of like homelessness is not just like what you see, or someone who's hassling you, or who is on your property when they shouldn't be, you know? It's someone who may just be had a weird situation or unsafe situation where they had to get out of. I still have family that sleep in their cars every night, and I still have friends that do that. And so like it's very important to create spaces like we created in East Oakland, where there is like beautiful art everywhere. You feel inspired, you feel activated, you're like, I can do something. There are these people, this person who painted my house is just like me, you know, it just came from the same circumstances as me, and is painting here, and is part of our community, and values me and wants my space to look beautiful, and my space to have meaning, you know. But also to have shade for what we totally think and appreciate the structure y'all built. Because even I hang out at the village a lot because I meet muralists, and we painted the ground mural. So while they were moved in, we were painting the ground mural, and I would hang out with a lot of the youth there, and their friends. And everyone was not complaining, but everyone was like, we need shade, we need some place to hang out because it's hot. And it's like Sally said, it's a repurposed parking lot, essentially. It's hot. And everyone was saying for weeks how they wanted shade. And then it came, it manifested, thanks to everybody here, you know. And people use it, and people appreciate that. And I think that's exactly the type of thing that we need to like be nurturing and growing and continuing to do. And that it is helpful, you know. And back to your question that you had for the keynote speaker, it is helpful. It's not just just because you still see people in the street, who are hurting, or who are experiencing real things, doesn't mean there are people who haven't healed and moved on and empowered themselves and accepted and appreciated help. Thank you.
One of the things that we're really excited about is the way that our project has been a model. And we're getting calls from all over the country and all over California from groups that want to replicate our model. And two of the things about it that I touched upon that are a model that we think are just super important is one, that the youth were involved in every element of creating this village. It is theirs. And they're still continuing to be leaders in the project. They have community meetings on a regular basis. They're involved in helping hire staff. They make like many of the decisions that involve their own tiny house village. And so we're getting a lot of calls from folks that want to learn about that they want to more deeply involve the people that are being served in decision making. And then also the model where we're using this space that is going to be perhaps used for another purpose at a later time. That's another element of it that's just an incredible model. And the other thing is that the art that's at our village, Eli worked with more than 100 muralists in creating the youth mural park at the tiny house village. And we're getting calls from all over the country that about the art and just the beauty of this village. And it really poses the question, who deserves beauty? Because we were recognized by the American Institute of Architects in the East Bay as one of 5 projects that they had tours of this summer. So we were excited about that. So anyway, we're really excited about the way that our project is serving as a model and the way that it can continue to influence solutions to the challenges of homelessness.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And so, the exciting thing is that this is really the beginning of that relationship. Lisa's going to talk in a moment of how we're actually going to be launching into that in the next few days, which everyone here and the many people online can come and join us to that partnership. Because normally, in past years, back in the olden days, we would have everybody sign up for what are we doing this next year. But we really wanted to be more intentional and go much deeper. To have a time where we can kind of get the state of the homelessness, look at the work we've done this year, look at some of the stuff we're launching into, and then really sit down together as a community, get to know each other, actually be in 3 dimensions with one another, and sign up for what kind of action do we want to take this year.
So I'm here to talk about what's next, and hopefully after hearing Dr. Davis and Sally and Eli, you're inspired just to impact one person or a whole village of people. And I want to talk about our Sukkot program. Sukkot's coming up next week, right? And our program—
4 days.
Our program is going to be on Wednesday, September 22nd, from 5:30 to 7 p.m. It will be in the courtyard, and we will have the sukkah. And the goals for this program are community building. Those of you who are here in the sanctuary or at home, we hope you'll join us. We want to extend our thoughts and our welcoming to you to join the Tzedek Council and be a part of our work. And we also have the goal of celebrating the work with tiny houses. And I don't know, Eli, will you be there? Yes? Okay. Eli is going to be there along with other people from Tiny Houses and Youth Spirit Artworks to lead us in a hands-on art project. And we want to have some of the beautiful art. We want to add to the beautiful art all over the village with a small piece from Temple Emanu-El to contribute to that beautiful space. And as Rabbi was saying, our last goal, or our third goal, is to kick off our Tzedek Council year. And so we hope you'll join us at this Sukkot program. If you are unable to join us or you want to know more about it, please reach out to, you can probably find, if you go to Tzedek Council, get involved, you'll see emails to reach us. And please reach out if you would like to join for this program, or if you're unable to and just want to be a part of the Tzedek Council programming, please reach out as well.
So thank you all for being here. I just also want to thank Eric here as well, and just all of the members of the Tzedek Council that's really made this year happen, as well as Heidi and Rebecca, who've been working tirelessly to try to get today's program done as well. So thank you all for being here, and Gamar Tov.